The sun sank low over the New Mexico frontier, its dying light spilling crimson across the parched earth of Redstone. Dust swirled in the evening breeze, clinging to the cracked boots of Elias Kane as he rode into town. At 40, he was a man, carved by time and loss, his face etched with scars from a civil war that still haunted his dreams. His gray eyes, shadowed beneath a weathered Stetson, scanned the horizon for trouble. As they always did, Elias was a drifter, a man who'd outrun his past through 1,000 miles of sagebrush and sorrow. Redstone, with its crooked storefronts and sagging saloon, was just another nowhere, a place to water his horse, choke down a whiskey, and slip away before dawn. Or so he thought. His mare, Dusty, snorted as he tied her to a splintered post outside the Rusty Spur Saloon. The air was thick with the scent of sun-baked leather and distant rain that never came. The town felt alive, but not in a good way, like a rattler coiled in the shadows, waiting to strike. Inside the saloon, the clink of glasses and low mutter of card players filled the smoky air. Elias pushed through the batwing doors, his duster brushing the floor, his revolver a heavy weight at his hip. The barkeep, a weary man with a nervous dick, slid a shot of whiskey across the counter without a word. Elias's fingers grazed the glass, but before he could drink, a small hand tugged at his sleeve. He looked down, and the world tilted. A girl, barely 12, stared up at him, her braid frayed like old rope, her brown eyes wide with a desperation that cut deeper than any blade. Her name was Clara, she said, her voice a trembling whisper, barely audible over the saloon's din. "Please buy my mom," she pleaded, clutching a tattered shawl to her chest. "They're selling her for a horse." The words struck Elias like a sledgehammer. He'd seen the worst of the West bandits, battles, betrayal, but this, a woman sold like livestock, her worth measured against a saddle and spurs. In 1880, in a town like Redstone, where land barons wrote the rules with blood and greed, such things happened. But knowing it didn't make it sit right. Clara's trembling finger pointed to the back of the saloon, where a crowd gathered like buzzards circling a carcass. Elias pushed through, his boots thudding on the warped pine floorboards, the air growing heavier with the stink of sweat and cheap cigars. There, in the flickering glow of oil lamps, stood Leela. Her dark hair fell in waves over her shoulders, her wrists bound with coarse rope. But her chin was high, her eyes blazing with a defiance that dared the world to break her. She wasn't just a victim, she was a storm, barely contained. Victor Creed, a land baron in a tailored suit that didn't belong in this dust-choked town, stood nearby, his gold tooth glinting as he barked orders to his men. Creed owned half of Redstone, and what he didn't own, he took. Lila's late husband had fought to keep their small patch of land, but he'd paid with his life. Now, Creed was auctioning Leela to settle the debt, offering her to a cattle rancher for a horse and a clear trade route. Elias's hand hovered over his revolver, his pulse hammering in his ears. He wanted to draw, to end this madness with a single shot. But then Lila's gaze locked onto his, and time unraveled like a cut rope. Those eyes, he knew them, 15 years ago. Before the war stole everything, he'd loved her. Leela, the girl he'd sworn to marry under a Tennessee oak, her laughter brighter than any sunrise. He'd left her behind, believing he had no choice when the bugles called him to battle. He'd heard she'd died, lost in the war's chaos. Yet here she was, older, harder, but unmistakably Leela. His breath caught, a tangle of guilt, longing, and shame tightening in his chest. He'd abandoned her, and now she stood here, her life priced at less than a good stallion. Clara's whisper echoed again, soft but piercing. "Please, mister, she's all I got." Elias glanced at the girl, her face a haunting echo of his little sister, taken by fever in the war's shadow. He wanted to walk away, to keep running from the ghosts that dogged his heels. But something in Clara's plea, in Lila's unyielding stare, rooted him to this moment. The saloon's noise faded, the world narrowing to the three of them: Elias, Clara, Leela, bound by a thread of fate he couldn't ignore. He stepped forward, the crowd parting like a river around a stone, his voice low but steady as iron. "How much for her freedom, Creed?" The room fell silent, every eye on the drifter who dared challenge Redstone's king. Creed's smirk was. A blade, his gold tooth catching the lamplight. More than you've got, cowboy, he drawled, his men chuckling like hyenas. Laughter rippled through the saloon, but Elias didn't flinch. He had no money, no plan, just a fire kindling in his gut. As he locked eyes with Leela, her defiance sparking a long-buried hope, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving Redstone without her. The sun bled red over the New Mexico horizon, painting the dusty trails of Redstone in hues of fire. Elias Kane rode into town, his boots heavy with the weight of 1,000 miles. His face, scarred from a war he'd rather forget, was half hidden under a weathered Stetson. The Civil War had taken his youth, his family, and his heart, leaving him a drifter chasing shadows across the frontier. Redstone was just another stop, a place to water his horse, grab a whiskey, and move on. Or so he thought. The rusty Spur Saloon's sign creaked in the dry wind. Elias tied his mare, Dusty, to a post, her hooves kicking up dust. Inside, the air smelled of stale beer and broken dreams. Men hunched over cards, eyeing Elias's revolver, its grip worn smooth from years of use. He ordered a whiskey, his voice low, when a small hand tugged at his duster. He looked down, and his heart stopped. A girl, barely 12, stood there, her braid frayed, her brown eyes wide with fear that cut deeper than any blade. Clara, she called herself, her voice a whisper. Please buy my mom, she said, clutching a tattered shawl. They're selling her for a horse. The words hit Elias like a bullet. He'd seen plenty in his 40 years battles, betrayal, death, but nothing like this. Selling a woman for a horse? In 1880 Redstone, desperation wrote its own laws. Clara pointed to the back of the saloon, where a crowd gathered like vultures. Elias pushed through, his boots thudding on the warped floorboards. There, in the flicker of oil lamps, stood Leela. Her dark hair fell in waves, her wrists bound, but her chin was high, her eyes burning with defiance. Victor Creed, a land baron in a tailored suit, barked orders to his men, his gold tooth glinting. Creed owned half of Redstone, and what he didn't own, he took. Lila's husband had fought for their land and paid with his life. Now, Creed was auctioning Leela to a cattle rancher for a horse and a trade route. Elias's hand hovered over his revolver, instinct screaming to draw. But Lila's gaze met his, and time unraveled. Those eyes, he knew them, 15 years ago, before the war. He'd loved her, promised her a life under a Tennessee oak. He'd left her, believing he had no choice, and heard she'd died in the war's chaos. Yet here she was, older, harder, but unmistakably Leela. His breath caught, guilt and longing tightening his chest. He'd abandoned her, and now her life was priced at less than a stallion. Clara's whisper echoed, "Please, mister, she's all I got." Elias glanced at the girl, her face an echo of his lost sister. He wanted to walk away, to keep running from his ghosts. But Clara's plea, Lila's stare, rooted him. He stepped forward, the crowd parting, his voice steady. "How much for her freedom, Creed?" The room fell silent, every eye on the drifter who challenged Redstone's king. Creed's smirk was sharp, his gold tooth catching the lamplight. "More than you've got, cowboy," he drawled, his men chuckling. Elias didn't flinch. He had no money, no plan, just a fire kindling in his gut. As he locked eyes with Leela, her defiance sparking hope, he knew he wasn't leaving Redstone without her. The saloon's laughter still echoed as Elias stepped into the night air. Creed's words cut deep, but Lila's gaze held him captive, dragging him back to a life he'd buried. Clara's whisper clung to him like dust on his boots. The stars glittered above. Indifferent to Redstone's troubles, Elias knelt beside Clara, his scarred face softening. "Where's your mom kept?" he asked, his voice low, like he was calming a spooked horse. Clara pointed to a squat adobe jail at the town's edge, its walls cracked by sun and neglect. "Creed's got her locked up till the auction at dawn," she said, her voice breaking. "Pa fought for our land. Creed shot him down." The words stirred Elias's own loss as his sister, his comrades, left bleeding in the war's shadow. He pressed a piece of hardtack into Clara's hand. "Stay close," he said. "We're gonna fix this." The livery stable smelled of hay and old. Leather, its air thick with secrets. Elias slipped inside. The glow of a lantern revealing Leela behind iron bars. Her wrists were chafed, but her posture was unyielding, like a willow in a storm. Two of Creed's men lounged nearby, rifles propped up, slurred by whiskey. Elias motioned Clara to hide behind feed sacks, then crept closer. His heart pounding, Lila's head snapped up, her eyes catching his. "Elias Kane," she said, her voice steel and sorrow. "Thought the war took you." He crouched by the bars, their cold iron biting his palms. "Thought it took you too," he said, his throat tight. "Why didn't you find me, Leela?" Her gaze dropped, fingers twisting her dress. "War broke everything. I married Tom to survive, to give Clara a home. He was good, till Creed wanted our land. He's buried under a cottonwood now." Elias's chest ached, guilt for leaving her mixing with her loss. "I'm getting you out," he said. Fierce, Leela shook her head. "Creed's got a dozen men, Elias, not alone." He leaned closer. "I ain't alone. Clara needs you. I ain't losing you again." A drunken shout cut them off. One of Creed's men staggered in, checking Lila's ropes before stumbling out. Elias slipped back to Clara, who looked up, pale but determined. "You taught me to whistle Shenandoah once," she said. Elias's lips twitched, a rare softness. He whistled a few notes, mournful, and Clara joined in, her breath shaky but steady. A fleeting bond. A fire bell clanged, shattering the moment. An orange glow lit the sky, a homesteader's barn, ablaze. Creed's men had struck, their torches a warning to Redstone. Elias ran toward the fire, Clara at his heels, the heat hitting like a wall. Townsfolk scrambled with buckets, their shouts drowned by collapsing beams. Elias pulled a boy from the flames, his coat singed, lungs burning. He carried him to his mother, her tears mixing with soot. Creed's men watched from horseback, laughing as they rode off. Elias's fists clenched, instinct screaming to fight. But he was one man against a dozen. The townsfolk's eyes lingered, hopeful, fearful. Clara tugged his sleeve. "You saved them," she said, fierce. Elias didn't answer. He wasn't a hero, just a man who'd failed too many times. He looked toward the jail, where Leela waited. Creed was a vulture, stripping Redstone's heart. Elias had no money, no army, just Clara's trust and Lila's fire dot as the flames faded. Clara opened her hand, revealing a silver locket. "It's Ma's," she said, her voice breaking. Elias brushed the locket, its weight heavy with memories. He took a deep breath, the night air sharp. "No one's taking your mom," he said, his words a vow. Redstone slept, but trouble stirred, and Elias Kane was done running. The night air stung Elias Kane's weathered skin as he stood in the shadows of Redstone's smoldering ruins, the acrid scent of burned timber lingering in his nostrils. Clara's small hand held out a silver locket, its faint gleam catching the moonlight like a whispered secret. "It's Ma's," she said, her voice trembling but resolute, heavy as the vow Elias had just carved into the desert night. "No one's taking your mom." The glow of the torched barn had faded, but its heat still simmered in his chest, a fire stoked by Victor Creed's cruelty and Clara's desperate trust. Redstone's streets lay silent under a sky studded with stars, the town asleep despite the trouble brewing. Elias's thoughts raced like a spooked herd, Lila's face defiant, bound, yet unbroken, burning in his mind. Dawn was creeping closer, and with it, Lila's auction. He led Clara into a shadowed alley, his boots whispering on the packed dirt, his gray eyes scanning for Creed's men lurking in the dark. "Stay low," he murmured, pressing his canteen into her hands, the metal cool against her fingers. "We're moving." Clara's wide eyes, fierce despite their fear, locked onto his. "You'll get Ma out, won't you, Mr. Kane?" she asked, her voice a fragile plea wrapped in a child's unshakable faith. Elias nodded, his jaw tight, his scarred face unreadable. He had no money, no posse, just a drifter's grit and a past that clung to him like dust. The adobe jail where Leela was held was a fortress tonight, Creed's men prowling like wolves around a wounded deer. Elias knew a direct assault would end in a bloodbath, and he'd seen enough of those in the war to last a lifetime. But he'd overheard saloon talk of Creed's hideout, a canyon camp 10 miles out. tucked in the jagged folds of the desert where the land baron stashed his plunder and sealed his deals. If Leela was to be auctioned at dawn, she'd be moved. There before first light, Elias led Clara to the livery stable, where Dusty, his mare, snorted softly, her breath warm in the cool night. He saddled her quickly, lifting Clara onto the mare's back, her small hands gripping the pommel. "Hold tight, kid," he said, swinging up behind her, his duster flapping like a raven's wings. The desert swallowed them as they rode, the silence broken only by the rhythmic clop of hooves and the rustle of sagebrush. Swaying in the wind, the canyon rose ahead, its walls looming under a sliver of moon, jagged as the teeth of some ancient beast carved from stone. Elias tethered Dusty behind a boulder, the mare's ears twitching at the distant howl of a coyote. He knelt beside Clara, his voice low but firm. "Don't move till I call your name," he said, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. She clutched the locket, its silver warm from her grip, and nodded, her braid swaying like a pendulum. Elias crept toward the camp, his revolver a heavy weight at his hip, the sand crunching softly under his boots. Torches flickered in the distance, their light dancing on canvas tents and tethered horses, casting long shadows that twisted like ghosts. Creed's men sprawled around a crackling fire, their laughter coarse, their voices carrying over the desert's hush. Elias's eyes found Leela, her hands still bound with coarse rope, sitting on the ground near a wagon piled with Creed's stolen goods, no doubt. Her dark hair fell in tangled waves, but her posture was unyielding, her gaze sharp as a blade. Then he saw something that turned his blood cold, a group of Comanche warriors, their faces painted with streaks of ochre, their leader, Red Hawk, standing tall under a gnarled cottonwood, speaking with Creed in low, measured tones. Elias's gut churned. This wasn't just an auction for a cattle rancher's horse. Creed was trading Leela to Red Hawk's band to secure a water source, a spring vital for his cattle routes through the desert. Water was worth more than gold in these parched lands, and Creed's empire hung on its flow. Elias edged closer, his body low behind a cluster of mesquite, the sharp scent of the brush mingling with the smoke of the fire. His boot brushed a twig, and it snapped, the sound small but deadly in the quiet. A guard spun, rifle raised, and a shot cracked through the night, the bullet kicking up sand inches from Elias's leg. The camp exploded into chaos, men shouting, horses snorting, torches swaying wildly. Elias dove into a shallow gully, his heart hammering, as a sudden sandstorm roared in from the desert, its howl swallowing the camp in a blinding swirl of grit and wind through the stinging dust. Elias saw Leela seize her chance. Her ropes, loosened in the frenzy, fell away as she lunged for a knife on the wagon, her movements swift and sure, her eyes blazing with the fire of a woman who'd never break. But before she could bolt, Red Hawk's warriors closed in, their spears catching the torchlight like deadly stars. Elias cursed under his breath, his fingers itching for his revolver. But he knew a gunfight here would end in slaughter, his, Lila's, and maybe Clara's. Waiting back in the dark, he needed to outthink, not outshoot. The sandstorm was his ally, its wail drowning his steps as he circled the camp, his duster snapping in the gale. He recalled Red Hawk's reputation, a warrior who prized honor over greed, a man who'd once spared a settler's life for a truthful word. Elias had little to offer his horse, his warm metals, a gamble on a spring he'd stumbled on days ago, but it was all he had. He stood, hands raised, and stepped into the flickering torchlight, the storm raging at his back. "Red Hawk," he shouted, his voice slicing through the wind. "I got words, not bullets." The warriors tensed, their spears poised, but Red Hawk raised a hand, his eyes narrowing like a hawk sizing up its prey. Creed bellowed, "Shoot the fool," but the storm buried his voice. Elias faced Red Hawk, the wind tearing at his coat, sand stinging his scarred face. "You don't want Leela," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Creed's using her to bind you to his dirty deals. Take my horse, my metals union silver, won with blood. Let her go, and I'll guide you to a spring I found 2 days back, clean water, free of any man's claim." Red Hawk's gaze bore into him, unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice deep as the canyon itself. Why risk your life for this woman? Elias's throat tightened. Lila's eyes locked on him from across the camp, her knife still clutched, her defiance a beacon. She's my past, he said, the words raw, and someone's future. Then came the truth that stopped his heart. Lila stepped forward, her voice cutting through the fading storm, steady as stone. I told Creed to trade me, she said, to keep Clara and the homesteaders safe from your raids. Elias froze, her words a knife to his gut, sharp and cold. She'd chosen this path, offered herself to shield her daughter and Redstones, people from bloodshed. His drive to save her, to erase the guilt of abandoning her years ago, had been for himself, not her sacrifice. The realization seared him, forcing him to see her not as the girl he'd lost, but as a woman stronger than he'd ever been. Red Hawk nodded, as if measuring her honor against Elias's offer. Prove the spring exists, he said, his voice final, and the woman walks free. The sandstorm eased, the air clearing, the stars peeking through the dust. Red Hawk's warriors lowered their spears, their eyes still wary. Creed lunged forward, his face twisted with rage, his gold tooth bared like a cornered wolf. But Red Hawk's men blocked him, their presence a wall. Elias met Lila's gaze, her eyes holding gratitude, resolve, and something softer, something that stirred the embers of their past. He whistled softly, a low note of Shenandoah, and Clara darted from the shadows, her small feet kicking up sand as she ran to her mother. The locket bouncing against her chest, Lila dropped the knife, her arms wrapping around Clara, their embrace a quiet defiance against the night's violence. Elias lifted them both onto Dusty, his hands steady despite the weight of what lay ahead, proving the spring, outrunning Creed's wrath. Creed's men regrouped, their shouts rising as they scrambled for their horses, their rifles glinting. Elias led Lila and Clara out of the canyon, the desert stretching vast before them, the promise of a spring and a reckoning waiting in the dawn. The desert stretched endless under the pre-dawn sky, its silence broken by the thunder of hooves as Elias Kane led Lila and Clara out of the canyon. Dusty, his mare, snorted under the weight of three, her breath steaming in the cool air. Behind them, Victor Creed's men rode hard, their shouts slicing through the night, their rifles glinting like fangs in the moonlight. Elias gripped the reins, his scarred face set, his heart still reeling from Lila's confession she'd offered herself to the Comanche. To protect Clara and Redstone, her strength humbled him, shamed him, made him see the selfish edge of his need to save her. Clara clung to her mother, the silver locket bouncing against her chest, its weight a quiet promise. Elias urged Dusty faster, the desert blurring past, sagebrush clawing at their legs. He had to reach the abandoned mission he'd seen days ago, a crumbling refuge where he could make a stand before leading Red Hawk to the spring. The mission's adobe walls rose from the sand like a ghost, its bell tower cracked but standing, a relic of 1880s New Mexico faith. Elias swung down, lifting Clara and Lila to the ground, his hands steady despite the ache in his side from the canyon's chaos. Inside, he said, his voice low, urgent. Lila's eyes met his, fierce but softened by something unspoken, and she pulled Clara through the mission's splintered door. Elias tethered Dusty in the shadow of a collapsed stable, then slipped inside, his revolver drawn, his war-honed instincts sharp. The air smelled of dust and old incense, the walls lined with faded saints staring down from peeling murals. He barricaded the door with a broken pew, his breath catching as he scanned the shadows for a defensible spot. Creed's men were close. Elias could hear their horses, their curses carried on the wind. He positioned himself at a shattered window, its glass long gone, the desert's gray light spilling through. Lila knelt beside Clara, whispering comfort, but her gaze flicked to Elias, a question in her eyes. You got a plan, Kane? She asked, her voice steady but edged with doubt. He gave a tight nod, his fingers checking his revolver's cylinder 6 shots. Not enough for Creed's dozen. Keep them talking, he said. Buy me time. Lila's lips pressed thin, but she nodded, her strength a quiet fire that steadied him. The riders thundered into the mission's courtyard, their shadows long and jagged. Creed's voice cut through, sharp as a whip. Come out, Drifter, you got nowhere to run. Elias peered through the window, spotting Creed on a black stallion, his gold tooth glinting. His men fanning out like wolves. Elias's mind raced. His war days flashing back. Vicksburg, Shiloh, traps set in the dark. He whispered to Leela, "There's a dry well out back. If I don't make it, you and Clara climb down, hide till dawn." Lila's hand gripped his arm, her touch electric. "You'll make it," she said, her voice fierce. "You always did." Elias rigged the mission with what he had: old ropes, a rusted lantern, a stack of rotten beams. He tied the ropes to the bell tower's base, ready to pull it down if needed, a desperate trap from a desperate man. As Creed's men dismounted, Elias stepped into the doorway, his revolver raised. "Let's talk, Creed," he called, his voice steady despite the odds. Creed laughed, cold and cruel. "Talk, you got nothing I want but a bullet." Elias's eyes narrowed. "You want Leela? You'll have to go through me." The fight erupted. Fast, Creed's men charged, guns blazing, bullets splintering the mission's walls. Elias fired back, his shots precise, dropping to men before ducking behind a pillar. Leela shielded Clara, her knife from the canyon ready, her eyes scanning. For a way to help, Elias moved like a shadow, using the mission's nooks to outmaneuver the attackers. He yanked the rope, and the bell tower groaned, crashing down in a cloud of dust and adobe, pinning 3 of Creed's men. The chaos gave him an edge, but not enough. A bullet grazed his shoulder, blood soaking his shirt, and he stumbled, his vision blurring. Then came the twist that changed everything. Clara, huddled behind a pew, opened her locket, her small fingers trembling. Inside was a faded photo: Elias and Leela, young, smiling under that Tennessee oak. A moment from a life they'd lost. "It's you," Clara whispered, her voice breaking through the gunfire. Elias froze, the sight of the photo a punch to his soul. Leela had kept it, carried him all these years, through war, loss, and pain. His guilt, his failure to find her, cracked open, replaced by a fierce need to make things right, not for himself, but for her, for Clara. He met Lila's eyes, and she nodded, tears glinting but her jaw set. "Finish this," she said. Elias surged forward, pain forgotten, his revolver barking. He took down 2 more men, their bodies crumpling in the dust. Creed, cornered, drew his pistol, but a new sound stopped him: cold hoof beats, heavy and fast. A U.S. Marshal, tipped off by a homesteader who'd seen the barn fire, rode in with a posse, their badges gleaming in the dawn. Creed's men faltered, and Elias seized the moment, tackling Creed into the dirt. "You're done," he growled, his fist slamming into Creed's jaw. The Marshal's men swarmed, cuffing Creed as he spat curses, his empire crumbling like the mission's walls. As the dust settled, Elias staggered to Leela and Clara, his shoulder bleeding, but his heart full. Lila's hand found his, her touch warm, grounding. "You kept us," she whispered, her voice thick with relief. Elias looked at Clara, clutching the locket, and saw the family he'd never dared hope for. The Marshal nodded to him, a grim respect in his eyes. "We'll take it from here, son," he said. Elias didn't answer, his gaze on Leela, on the photo that had carried their past into this moment. The mission saints watched in silence as dawn broke, painting the desert gold, a new day promising something more than survival. The desert dawn broke over New Mexico, its golden light spilling across the crumbling adobe walls of the mission where Elias Kane stood, his shoulder still seeping blood, his scarred hand clasped tightly in Lila's. Clara nestled against her, mother, her small fingers clutching the silver locket. Its faded photo of a young Elias and Leela, a fragile bridge across 15 years of loss. Victor Creed was gone, his gold-toothed sneer silenced, hauled off in chains by the U.S. Marshal's posse, their hoof beats fading into the dust. The mission's faded saints stared down from peeling murals, their silent gaze blessing a new day. In 1880 Redstone, Elias's chest heaved, the weight of the night's fight settling like sand after a storm. He'd saved Leela, kept Clara's family whole, but the ghosts of his past war, guilt, the sister he couldn't save still whispered in the quiet corners of his heart. Elias led Leela and Clara to a small ranch just beyond Redstone's borders, a patch of land spared from Creed's greed, its cottonwood trees swaying in the morning breeze. their leaves rustling like a soft hymn. The air smelled of sage and fresh earth, a promise of beginnings. Elias tied Dusty to a weathered post, the mare's muzzle brushing his arm as if she, too, felt the shift in the wind. Clara darted ahead, her braid bouncing, her laughter cutting. Through the stillness, a sound Elias hadn't heard since his sister's voice was stolen. By war's fevered hand, Leela watched her daughter, her dark hair catching the sunlight, then turned to Elias, her eyes soft but searching, carrying the weight of unspoken years. "You didn't have to stay, Elias," she said, her voice low, trembling with the ache of their shared past. Elias met her gaze, his throat tight, his words rough but true. "I didn't stay for me," he said. "I stayed for you, for Clara, for what we might have been." Lila's fingers brushed the locket, now resting against her chest, and her smile was small but warm, like a fire kindled after a long, cold night. Days turned to weeks on the ranch, the desert's harsh edges softening under their care. Elias taught Clara to ride Dusty, her small hands gripping the reins as she giggled, the mare trotting under a wide, cloudless sky. He showed her how to read the land where the cacti bloomed, where the jackrabbits hid, his voice steady, his scarred face softening with every laugh she gave. One crisp morning, as Elias split wood near the corral, the rhythmic thud of his axe was broken by the sound of hooves, steady and deliberate. His hand drifted to his revolver, old instincts flaring, but the rider was no enemy, a lone Comanche. Warrior, his face unpainted, his eyes calm, reined up, a leather pouch in his hand. "From Red Hawk," he said, his voice deep as the desert itself. He handed Elias the pouch, revealing a beaded bracelet, its intricate patterns of blue and red glinting in the sun. "For the girl," the rider said, nodding toward Clara, who watched wide-eyed from the porch, her braids swaying. "For the spring you promised and the honor you showed." Elias's breath caught, his fingers tracing the beads. He hadn't yet led Red Hawk to the spring, but this bracelet, a Comanche tradition of alliance, rare in these years of mistrust, carried a weight heavier than gold. It was a gesture of peace, a bridge across a divide, rooted in the fragile trust of 1880s frontier life. The rider nodded once, then turned, his horse vanishing into the shimmering heat. That evening, under the cottonwood's dappled shade, Elias sat with Leela, Clara asleep between them, the bracelet now circling her small wrist, its beads catching the last light. The locket gleamed against Lila's chest, its photo a tether to their past, a promise of their future. "I carried you here," Elias said, his voice rough, tapping his temple. "All those years, through every fight, every mile." Lila's hand found his, her touch warm, steady, forgiving. "And I carried you," she said, her fingers brushing the locket, her eyes glistening. "We found each other again." Elias looked out at the desert, its vastness no longer a place to flee, but a place to belong. Redstone was mending, its people rebuilding, and he was no longer a drifter. He was home, bound to Leela and Clara, their makeshift family, a quiet victory over the